You are told to wait. Wait for prosperity to trickle down. Wait for reforms that never arrive. Wait for justice that is always postponed. And you are told this not because patience is a virtue, but because your patience is profitable. From the first moment a worker enters the world of labor, a great lie confronts them. That poverty is temporary, that suffering is necessary, that endurance is noble. The poor are instructed to be patient precisely because impatience would be dangerous to those who rule. Patience keeps the factory running, the rent paid, the profit flowing upward. Patience is the ideology of the oppressed, manufactured by the oppressor. Let us be clear. Poverty is not an accident, nor a moral failure, nor the result of insufficient effort. Poverty is a social condition produced by a system that concentrates wealth in the hands of a few by extracting value from the labor of the many. Capital does not create wealth, labor does. Machines do not generate profit, human beings do. Yet the fruits of this labor are seized, accumulated, and weaponized against those who produce them. The worker sells their labor power not because it is fair, but because survival leaves no alternative. Wages are set not by justice, but by the minimum required to keep the worker alive and productive. Everything above that minimum becomes surplus value, appropriated by the owner of capital. This is not exchange between equals, it is legalized exploitation. And when the exploited ask why their lives never improve, they are told to be patient. Patience, in this system, is discipline. It trains the poor to accept insecurity as fate and inequality as nature. It teaches them to hope individually instead of acting collectively. It convinces them that salvation will arrive through personal sacrifice rather than social transformation. Meanwhile, those who own the means of production never practice patience. They demand immediate returns, immediate growth, immediate obedience. Time, like wealth, belongs to them. Observe how crises function. When profits fall, workers are laid off. When prices rise, workers are told to tighten their belts. When markets collapse, public wealth rescues private capital. At every stage, the burden is placed upon those with the least power. And again, they are told to wait for recovery, for stability, for the future. The future, however, is continuously stolen from them. The ruling ideas of every age are the ideas of the ruling class. They glorify hard work while inheriting wealth. They praise competition while practicing monopoly. They preach patience to the hungry while living off accumulated labor they never performed. Through religion, nationalism, and moralism, they disguise exploitation as destiny and obedience as virtue. Yet history does not move forward through patience alone. History advances through struggle. Every gain made by the working class, shorter hours, higher wages, social protections, was not gifted by benevolence, but forced by organization and resistance. Rights are not granted, they are seized. Power concedes nothing without pressure. The greatest weapon of capital is division. Worker against worker, employed against unemployed, native against migrant, man against woman. As long as the oppressed remain fragmented, they can be managed, disciplined, and pacified. Unity terrifies those in power because it exposes a simple truth. The many create everything, and the few own it only by consent and coercion. The task before the working class is not to beg for patience, but to abolish the conditions that demand it. This requires consciousness, an understanding that individual suffering is rooted in collective exploitation. It requires organization, unions, movements, parties capable of confronting capital as a class force. And it requires courage, the willingness to reject the morality of submission and replace it with the ethics of solidarity. A society that tells millions to wait while a handful live in excess is not stable. It is preparing its own rupture. The contradiction between socialized labor and private ownership cannot be resolved by patience. It can only be resolved by transformation. When those who produce the wealth of society also control it, the command to be patient will lose its power. The poor are told to be patient because patience keeps the world as it is. Impatience, organized and conscious, is what changes it. Patience is often lauded as a virtue, a moral quality that elevates character and guides individuals toward eventual reward. Yet when examined in the context of social and economic power, Patience reveals itself as a carefully constructed tool of oppression. Those who govern the structures of society, those who own and control the means of production, have long understood that the compliance of the masses is not secured through fear alone, nor through force alone, but through ideology, through the subtle conditioning of consciousness. Patience, in this sense, functions as a disciplinary mechanism, a means of inculcating in the working class the belief that their suffering is temporary, that improvement is only a matter of waiting, that the accumulation of wealth and comfort in society will inevitably reach them if they endure long enough. The promise of eventual relief is a potent illusion, for it directs attention away from the systemic origins of poverty and exploitation, framing inequality as a personal or moral failing rather than the product of a social order structured to benefit a minority at the expense of the majority. From the earliest moments of life, individuals are taught to defer satisfaction, to accept delay as natural, to internalize the notion that hardship is a necessary stage of development. Schools, religious institutions, and family structures often reinforce this conditioning, portraying patience as inherently virtuous while simultaneously neglecting to address the structural barriers that make patience necessary. In the workplace, patience is similarly valorized. Workers are instructed to tolerate low wages, poor conditions, and arbitrary hierarchies because their diligence will eventually be rewarded. Promotions, raises, and benefits are promised as future compensations for present sacrifice, yet in reality, these increments are measured not by fairness or necessity, but by the capacity of the employer to extract surplus value from labor. The working class is trained to equate patience with responsibility, obedience, and moral worth, while impatience is cast as greed, laziness, or folly. This moral framing is not neutral, it serves the interests of those who benefit from exploitation. Capital thrives when labor is willing to wait, when the oppressed internalize the logic of delay, and when the collective power of workers is fragmented by the discipline of deferred satisfaction. Patience, therefore, is a mechanism for sustaining inequality. It pacifies resistance by instilling the belief that immediate action is unnecessary, that the system will eventually correct itself, that justice will arrive in time. But time, under capitalism, is not an impartial arbiter. It is commodified and regulated to serve profit. The clock measures the rhythm of production, not the fulfillment of human needs, and the temporal horizon offered to the oppressed is perpetually extended, leaving them suspended between desire and deprivation. The ideology of patience also functions to individualize social problems. By emphasizing personal endurance, it diverts attention from collective causality, framing poverty, unemployment, and insecurity as issues to be managed privately rather than addressed through structural change. Individuals are told to cultivate resilience, to work harder, to save, to sacrifice, and to trust in the moral arc of society, even as the economic structures that maintain inequality remain unchallenged. This framing obscures the fact that poverty is not a transient condition awaiting the passage of time, but a sustained outcome of an exploitative system. Furthermore, patience is reinforced through culture and media, which celebrate narratives of delayed gratification and self-made success, while minimizing or ignoring the systemic obstacles that hinder collective advancement. Stories of individual triumph over adversity serve as cautionary tales to the masses, suggesting that persistence alone is sufficient while reinforcing the idea that structural inequities are natural or inevitable. This manufactured consent ensures that impatience, the only force capable of destabilizing the entrenched power of the ruling class, is suppressed. True agency, the ability to act collectively, to transform society, is subordinated to the moral injunction to wait. Patience, therefore, is not a neutral attribute but a deliberate instrument of control, shaping consciousness, regulating behavior, and maintaining the conditions that allow exploitation to persist. By conditioning the oppressed to accept delay as necessary and natural, the ruling class secures compliance, prevents revolt, and perpetuates a social order in which wealth is concentrated and inequality is normalized. Poverty is not a result of personal failure, laziness, or lack of intelligence. It is a structural condition embedded within the very framework of capitalist society. To understand poverty in this context, one must recognize that the economic system in which we live is designed to extract value from the labor of the many while concentrating wealth in the hands of the few. Capitalism is not an impartial mechanism of exchange or progress. It is a mode of production that relies on the exploitation of human labor as its foundation. Workers do not create wealth for themselves, but for those who own the means of production. And it is this extraction of surplus value that generates both immense wealth for the ruling class and persistent deprivation for the working masses. The organization of production under capitalism inherently produces inequality because the fruits of labor are not distributed according to need, contribution, or fairness, but according to ownership and power. Those who control factories, land, machinery, and financial capital determine how much of the wealth created by labor will return to the workers in the form of wages, and how much will be accumulated as profit, reinvested or hoarded by capitalists. This structural relationship ensures that a portion of the population must always live in poverty, for the accumulation of capital depends upon a labor force that is exploited, disciplined, and maintained at the lowest possible cost. The logic of the market disguises this reality through the rhetoric of meritocracy, suggesting that wealth is earned individually and that poverty is the consequence of personal shortcomings. Yet this narrative ignores the fact that labor itself produces the value that capital appropriates. Every commodity sold, every service provided is the product of human effort, yet only a fraction of that value is returned to the laborer, while the rest is claimed by the capitalist as profit. Poverty is therefore not a misfortune to be alleviated through charity alone, but a predictable outcome of a system built to privilege ownership over labor. This structural exploitation extends beyond wages. The organization of work under capitalism produces insecurity, instability, and vulnerability, ensuring that workers remain dependent on employers for their livelihoods. Jobs are temporary, benefits are conditional, and the threat of unemployment looms constantly, reinforcing a hierarchy in which workers must accept subordination in exchange for survival. Housing, healthcare, education, and other necessities are also commodified, meaning that access depends on one's ability to pay rather than on social rights. Those who labor cannot secure the essentials of life without surrendering significant portions of their energy and time, perpetuating cycles of poverty that are reproduced across generations. Furthermore, capitalism relies on the division of labor and the segmentation of social groups to maintain control. Racism, sexism, and xenophobia are not incidental to poverty, but are often leveraged to divide the working class, ensuring that collective resistance to exploitation remains weak and fragmented. The poorest are frequently those who face compounded barriers. Marginalized communities are overrepresented in low-wage work, underrepresented in positions of power, and subject to systemic discrimination that reduces opportunities for economic mobility. Poverty is therefore not merely a matter of insufficient resources, it is the structural outcome of social arrangements that prioritize profit over human well-being and that organize production and distribution in a way that necessitates inequality. The law, the state, and cultural institutions reinforce these arrangements. Tax policies, labor regulations, and social norms are often designed to protect property and capital while regulating, rather than eliminating, the conditions of poverty. Education and training programs may promise opportunity, but they cannot alter the fundamental relations of production that ensure wealth is appropriated by a minority. Charitable interventions and temporary relief measures may ease suffering, but they cannot restructure a system whose very survival depends on the persistence of a class of impoverished laborers. The structural nature of poverty is evident in the global context as well. Wealth is concentrated not only within nations, but between them, with former colonies and resource-rich regions subjected to extraction and exploitation that enrich distant elites while leaving local populations in deprivation. International trade, debt, and financial systems operate to perpetuate this inequality, making poverty a systemic feature of global capitalism rather than a temporary or localized problem. Understanding poverty as structural also reframes the concept of responsibility. It is not the moral failing of individuals that produces deprivation, but the economic, political, and social systems that enforce exploitation, maintain hierarchies, and limit the agency of the many. The working class, by its very position in the production process, is both necessary to wealth creation and systematically deprived of its full fruits. Recognizing poverty as structural demands, a recognition that alleviation is not a matter of patience, reform, or individual effort alone, but requires fundamental transformation of the economic relationships that create it. Only by addressing the systemic roots of inequality, by challenging the ownership of the means of production, and by organizing collective action to redistribute power and resources, can the structural poverty inherent in capitalism begin to be dismantled. Wealth is not a mysterious force that exists independently of human effort. It is produced through labor, through the application of human energy, creativity, and intellect to transform raw materials into goods, services, and knowledge. Every commodity, every product, every advancement in society is the result of human work. Yet in capitalist society, the fruits of this labor are systematically seized and controlled by a small ruling class, those who own the means of production. The worker, who is the true source of wealth, receives only a fraction of the value they create in the form of wages, while the surplus, the difference between what labor produces and what the worker is paid, is expropriated as profit. This process is neither accidental nor morally neutral. It is the defining characteristic of capitalism. From the factory to the office, from the farm to the marketplace, labor is the engine of creation. Yet the products of this engine are not returned to those who operate it, but are appropriated by owners of capital, who claim them as their own. Machines, buildings, and money are treated as sources of wealth in popular discourse, but they are inert without the labor that activates them. It is labor that transforms coal into electricity, cotton into cloth, ideas into innovation, raw earth into harvest. The capitalist receives not because they worked, but because they control the instruments through which others must work to survive. This relationship produces a profound structural injustice. Those who contribute nothing beyond ownership reap the majority of rewards, while those whose labor sustains society are confined to subsistence and dependency. The extraction of surplus value is not merely economic, it is social and political. Laws, institutions, and social norms are organized to protect the property of the ruling class and to legitimize the appropriation of wealth. Labor contracts, wages, and employment regulations are designed to regulate the distribution of resources in a manner that maintains the dominance of capital, ensuring that workers cannot claim the full product of their efforts. Even when workers are compensated, the payment is always less than the value they create, and this structural imbalance accumulates as wealth for the owners while perpetuating economic vulnerability for the laboring majority. The ideology of merit and individual effort further obscures this reality. Society teaches that wealth belongs to those who earn it, implying that laborers receive less because they contribute less, when in fact their contribution is the source of all surplus. The capitalist system relies on this illusion to maintain consent, portraying ownership as the reward for skill, foresight, or risk-taking, while obscuring the fact that without the labor of the many, capital would produce nothing. Even crises highlight this dynamic. During recessions, layoffs, wage cuts, and austerity measures are imposed upon workers, yet financial bailouts and protections are extended to owners and investors. Wealth is concentrated at the top, even as those at the bottom endure deprivation and uncertainty. The ruling class benefits from the labor of the masses not only directly through production, but indirectly through social organization. Education, healthcare, and infrastructure, funded by the labor of many through taxation or social contribution, enable productivity. Yet the fruits of that productivity are siphoned upward. The very conditions that sustain labor, physical health, knowledge, and social stability are shaped and maintained to the benefit of capital owners while reinforcing the subordination of workers. This seizure of wealth is maintained through the control of power. The state, legal systems, and cultural institutions operate to protect private property and to regulate labor in ways that favor capital accumulation. Worker unrest is often contained through laws, policing, and social pressure, while mechanisms such as media, religion, and ideology normalize inequality, portraying it as natural, inevitable, or morally justified. Resistance is framed as disorder, greed, or imprudence, ensuring that the structural expropriation of labor remains largely unquestioned. Globalization extends this dynamic beyond national boundaries. Multinational corporations extract labor and resources from distant lands, paying minimal compensation while accumulating immense wealth for shareholders. Laborers in one region support the consumption and lifestyles of elites elsewhere, demonstrating that the seizure of wealth is not merely local or incidental but a systemic feature of capitalist relations. Understanding that wealth is produced by labor but seized by the ruling class is essential to comprehending the nature of economic inequality. It is not a matter of luck, talent, or effort. It is a structural reality that shapes every aspect of social life. The exploitation of labor under capitalism ensures that those who produce value are never fully compensated, while those who control capital accumulate wealth and power in proportion to the labor of others. This relationship is reinforced through law, ideology, and culture, creating a society in which the creative, productive energy of the many sustains the luxury and dominance of the few, and the perpetuation of this imbalance is treated as natural, inevitable, or morally justified. Unity and collective struggle are not mere ideals or abstract moral principles. They are the essential instruments by which the working class and oppressed populations can confront the structural exploitation that defines capitalist society. The very logic of capitalism depends on division, between worker and worker, between employed and unemployed, between citizen and immigrant, between man and woman, between one community and another. This fragmentation ensures that the power of labor is diffused and that collective resistance remains weak. When workers are isolated, when they are pitted against one another in competition for scarce wages or recognition, they cannot effectively challenge the system that exploits them. Capital thrives not only on the extraction of surplus value, but also on the social mechanisms that prevent solidarity, fostering mistrust, envy, and rivalry among those whose common interest lies in cooperation. The ruling class understands that the few can dominate the many only if the many remain divided, and so ideology, culture, and policy are structured to reinforce separation and discourage collaboration. Collective struggle, therefore, is the conscious and organized response to this imposed fragmentation. It requires recognition that individual suffering is not the product of personal failure but of systemic oppression, and that the interests of laborers are shared across workplaces, regions, and even nations. It demands that workers and oppressed groups see themselves not as isolated actors competing for scraps, but as a class whose strength emerges from mutual support, shared goals, and coordinated action. History demonstrates the power of such unity. Every gain achieved by the working class, shorter hours, improved wages, social protections, legal rights, was not granted by the benevolence of capitalists or the state, but forced through the organized collective action of laborers. Strikes, protests, unionization, and political mobilization illustrate that when the exploited act together, they can disrupt the mechanisms of production, challenge property relations, and assert demands for justice that cannot be ignored. Conversely, when movements are fragmented, when solidarity falters, the system absorbs dissent, making concessions minimal and temporary while preserving the overall structure of exploitation. Collective struggle is not merely a tactical necessity, it is a moral and intellectual imperative. It cultivates class consciousness, the awareness that individual grievances are symptoms of systemic injustice, and that liberation can be achieved only through joint effort. Through organization, workers learn to identify the sources of exploitation, the structures that sustain inequality, and the strategies that can dismantle them. Education, discussion, and mutual aid within movements strengthen this consciousness, transforming disparate frustrations into coherent, directed action. Unity is reinforced through shared struggle. It is forged in the experience of coordinated resistance, in the mutual defense of rights, in the solidarity expressed across sectors, regions, and social groups. Each victory achieved through collective effort strengthens the belief in the power of organized labor, and each setback underscores the necessity of persistent collaboration. Moreover, Collective struggle extends beyond economic demands. It encompasses social, political, and cultural dimensions, challenging oppression in all its forms. Racism, sexism, xenophobia, and other mechanisms of division are not incidental but integral to maintaining exploitation. Confronting them requires intersectional solidarity, in which workers recognize that the liberation of one group is inseparable from the liberation of all. International solidarity further amplifies this principle. In a globalized economy, laborers in one country support the profits of capital owners in another, and so the struggle must also transcend national borders. Coordination across regions and nations, sharing knowledge, tactics, and support, undermines the ability of capital to isolate and discipline the workforce, demonstrating that collective struggle is not limited to local conditions but is a global necessity. The power of unity is also psychological and strategic. When workers and oppressed communities act together, they challenge the legitimacy of hierarchical power and disrupt the certainty with which the ruling class presumes compliance. Strikes halt production, boycotts affect profits, protests demand attention, and organized political movements can reshape laws and institutions. Dispersed or isolated action, no matter how sincere, lacks the leverage to force structural change, and this is why fragmentation is encouraged by those in power. Collective struggle also fosters resilience. In the face of repression, intimidation, and systemic pressure, the bonds of solidarity provide material, moral, and emotional support. Workers are able to sustain resistance, protect one another, and maintain momentum over time, recognizing that their strength lies not in solitary endurance but in communal effort. Unity and collective struggle transform society not only by challenging exploitation directly, but also by cultivating a culture of mutual responsibility, shared purpose, and democratic engagement. They lay the foundation for alternative forms of social organization, in which resources, decision-making, and power are distributed according to need and participation rather than inherited privilege. By acting together, the oppressed assert their agency, reclaim the wealth they create, and demonstrate the possibility of a society organized for human well-being rather than for the profit of a few. The realization of this principle requires vigilance, commitment, and courage, as the forces arrayed against unity are persistent, strategic, and often violent. Yet the history of labor movements, revolutions, and social change confirms that organized, collective action is the only pathway through which exploitation can be confronted, challenged, and ultimately dismantled. Social transformation, not individual endurance, is the true path to justice. Because the injustices and inequalities that pervade society are not the result of personal shortcomings, moral failings, or individual misfortune, but of systemic structures that concentrate power and wealth in the hands of a few while subordinating the majority. To focus solely on individual effort is to misdiagnose the problem and to misdirect energy. No amount of personal perseverance, self-discipline, or patience can dismantle the structural mechanisms that perpetuate exploitation. The capitalist system, for example, is designed to extract value from the labor of many while distributing it according to ownership rather than contribution. Wages, opportunities, and resources are allocated not on the basis of fairness, but on the maintenance of hierarchies that benefit the ruling class. Under such a system, telling individuals to endure hardship, to work harder, to wait for eventual reward, functions as an ideological tool to pacify dissent and justify inequality. Individual endurance may temporarily sustain survival, but it does not challenge the roots of injustice, nor does it alter the relations of power that define the social order. Social transformation, by contrast, targets these roots. It seeks to reorganize the relationships between labor and capital, to redistribute wealth, to restructure institutions, and to replace systems that perpetuate inequality with those that prioritize collective well-being. Transformation recognizes that injustice is not accidental. It is produced and reproduced through laws, customs, economic practices, and political policies. By confronting these structures, society moves beyond the moralistic framing of poverty, oppression, and deprivation as individual failures and addresses them as collective problems requiring collective solutions. History demonstrates that meaningful change emerges not from the patience or endurance of isolated individuals, but from organized, sustained, and collective action aimed at systemic reform. Labor movements, political revolutions, social campaigns, and grassroots organizing illustrate that when people unite around shared goals, they can challenge entrenched power, demand rights, and create alternatives that would be impossible through personal effort alone. Strikes, protests, collective bargaining, and community mobilization amplify the voices of the oppressed, redistribute negotiating power, and reshape social norms, showing that structural injustice can be contested only when action is taken collectively. Social transformation also entails a shift in consciousness. Individuals must recognize that their personal struggles are connected to the broader patterns of exploitation and oppression in society. Endurance without awareness is powerless, for it perpetuates the belief that suffering is inevitable and that social hierarchies are natural. By contrast, understanding the systemic nature of injustice allows people to organize, strategize, and act in ways that address not just symptoms but causes. Transformation involves both material and cultural dimensions. Materially, it demands changes in the ownership of resources, access to education, healthcare, and employment, and the elimination of practices that concentrate wealth and power unjustly. Culturally, it requires challenging ideologies that justify inequality, reshape consciousness to value cooperation over competition, and cultivate solidarity across different social groups. The focus on social transformation also recognizes the interconnectedness of different forms of oppression. Racism, sexism, xenophobia, and other systems of domination are not isolated phenomena, but are intertwined with economic exploitation. Efforts to achieve justice must therefore be comprehensive, aiming to dismantle all structures that perpetuate domination rather than simply enabling individual survival within them. Endurance, while often praised as a moral quality, is insufficient because it implicitly accepts the status quo and places the burden of justice on the individual. It encourages adaptation to oppressive conditions rather than challenging them, perpetuating cycles of exploitation. True justice requires altering the conditions themselves so that survival, opportunity, and dignity are not privileges but rights. Social transformation is also forward-looking. It envisions a society in which the wealth created by labor is equitably shared, where access to resources and opportunities is determined by need and contribution rather than inheritance or ownership, and where democratic participation allows all members of society to influence the rules that govern their lives. This vision contrasts sharply with the idea that individual endurance alone can achieve fulfillment, which isolates responsibility within the individual and ignores the collective nature of both oppression and liberation. By organizing, educating, and mobilizing collectively, people can replace structures of exploitation with structures of justice, shifting society from a framework that prioritizes profit and hierarchy to one that prioritizes human well-being, equality, and empowerment. Social transformation, therefore, is not an abstract ideal but a practical necessity. It recognizes that justice is not granted by rulers, nor discovered through patience, nor achieved through solitary effort, but constructed through the conscious, organized action of people committed to changing the systems that govern their lives and shape their destinies. In conclusion, the call for patience, the endurance of poverty, and the promise of individual salvation under capitalism are illusions designed to maintain a system that benefits the few at the expense of the many. Wealth is produced by the labor of the working class, yet it is seized and controlled by the ruling elite, while structural exploitation ensures that poverty is a permanent condition for the majority. The persistence of inequality is maintained through division, ideological manipulation, and social fragmentation, all of which discourage resistance and uphold the power of capital. True liberation cannot be achieved through waiting, suffering, or solitary effort. It requires consciousness, solidarity, and collective struggle. Unity among workers and oppressed populations transforms individual grievances into organized action capable of challenging the foundations of exploitation. Social transformation, not individual endurance, is the pathway to justice, as it seeks to dismantle the structures of oppression, redistribute power and resources, and create a society in which human dignity and equality are prioritized over profit and hierarchy. Only through collective awareness, organized resistance, and the deliberate restructuring of social, economic, and political relations can the working class reclaim the wealth they produce and achieve the justice that has long been denied to them.